but really getting them to say 2 students read 10 books instead of like 2 10, which investigation still says is acceptable in third.
Yeah.
So in the K1 COI, first grade is doing this unit too, so we just reviewed it. And we noticed that in the assessments, the questions are really open-ended, but then when you go to grade them, they should have said all of these things, but it wasn't explicit. So I think in your anchor charts and when you teach it, you know, talk about the vocab, talk about when you're asked this open-ended question, you're saying these 3 things every single time.
Yeah.
And James gave that great idea of painting the picture of the graph to talk about all the points instead of there are 10 students and this should be labeled.
Yeah.
And so maybe on your criteria, going back to the criteria,
Yeah.
on the plot it has a line here and they fill it in. So that's a scaffold. Like there's always something, it's a title.
Well, something that I've been doing, kind of like under criteria, is like, so every time I send them off to their desks, like in investigations, like usually it's just like a blank box, like go and answer the question with this box. But what I've been doing is writing like estimate and like highlight it, and then the next thing like strategy, equation, explain. And so like, and I will say to them like, you have to have these 4 things in order for your answer to be completed. And as an acceptable answer, and like showing them obviously like here are examples of where students did this well, but maybe doing this here too, where like every time we send them off, like reminding and highlighting like these are the 4 things you need for an acceptable answer.
I do that also, and then I kind of pressure with time, like really quickly. These are the first 3 things that you need to put down on your paper, and then just like getting them into the habit. Like the first thing that you do is put this stuff down, even like that, or with timing them.
Another thing we did that was really helpful was like a how to read a graph. Like anchor chart with all the components labeled. Again, I don't think like them having to say x-axis or y-axis is what's important, but really getting them to read the components. And then you said something else again. Oh, I think building into your morning wins times to like flash interpret real life data. So like you can link it to anything. Like you can link it to SCL. Like last night I got this many. I took a graph of how many hours I've slept over the week. We need to focus on self-care. Like you can link it to other things, but getting them to like look and going back to what we said last unit about the purpose of reading the graph. Like what do you notice? What are the kind of trends, or you know, what are the important things to notice, instead of them saying really arbitrary statements that aren't meaningful. Getting them to say like, whoa, on Wednesday you read you slept 14 hours, you know, whatever it is that's like notable, and you can give it a fun phrase like noteworthy data. Those were definitely gaps for us, like trends. Being able to explicitly articulate, and then being able to explicitly articulate what they're going to be assessed on.
So, and then also in 3rd grade, I know that they talk a lot about clumping data and making generalizations about groups of data, clusters. Then that's where we go, and I'm curious, I know they're coming about making a key for a line plot, and like the X means, but then I also thought like for clusters, what would you think would be the best way for us to be preparing them?
What is the
cluster?
So it would be like
in this? It would
here
be towards the end.
So this would be the cluster of data.
So it's just like a concentration.
So like circling that part and saying like talk about this cluster.
The majority of our class read somewhere between 80 to 100 or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a vote, but do other people have votes? What they think about cluster?
About whether it should be introduced or not.
I mean, I think they would be able to do it. Like if you were to say like,
More or less time.
I don't know.
We got in 3rd grade, we would push like, it would be where's the cluster, and then what does that tell us about the data, like unpacking it. Like this says like most of the students in this class, like I feel like maybe if anything in 2nd grade, it might just be noticing where it is. Do you see data that seems to be together in a group? But it was I feel like it took, I don't know, I feel like it was really 3rd grade appropriate. I don't know how 2nd grade would be able to really focus on that.
What do you think? I think it's really challenging. I would focus on like being able to interpret the data accurately first. Because I think it's like the next step to be able to like understand trends and overall, like, it's manipulating it more. It's like a level 4 of interpreting it instead of reading it. And they struggled so much with reading it accurately and being able to not just attach values, but really say, what does the 10 and 2 mean? Like 10 students read 2 books, because they interchange that, so they're both numbers. Like they just like really struggled on the assessment last year on like saying, what does the 2 mean? Like they would be like 2 students when the number's 2 on the bottom on the y-axis.
So do you think that like that could be a small group with our high kids who?
If they're, I think that's certainly an extension. It's so helpful to know where to push them.
Yeah.
If they're like
Right.
super able to read and interpret the data, like giving them sentence frames to push their thinking about how to interpret it.
Did you guys have like math vocab sentence frames for this unit?
One thing that was helpful that I think James in 3rd grade recommended was making anchor charts of posters using, and we can send this to you, using sentence frames from the date or the vocab we needed them to use, and making anchor charts for like a class graph. So we would have the anchor charts posted, but then we'd fill in the blanks of the poster so that they could see like how to use that. Together we would come up with how to use the stems, but then they'd have it as like an anchor throughout the unit.
Got it. So it'd be like a poster with stems,
Does that make
but
sense?
then you fill them in,
Right.
so that they would know how to use them, but there would be the
The
stem
visual
there.
to like anchor
Got
them.
it. Yeah, whatever you guys have would be great to see.
They're not generic stems.
They are generic stems. Let me find it.
Yeah, we need that little poster with like the range of the data is.
Yes. Useful phrases for line blocks. Oh, and we also used our math journals to put in like ways to read a graph, and then we would label as a class, and they would glue it into their math journal as like a reference point of like what is each part of the graph called, or what's a key, and they could open up.
When thinking about a pre-assessment, what key topics should we be prefacing?
Assessment, just to know what the gaps are going in, you're thinking?
Yeah.
Well, in 1st grade, it looked like the assessment for this was doing like you get the information about a class, and it's like they like this over this. Maybe you remember this. It was like, do you prefer to study space or under the ocean or underwater? And so what they did was they gave them a class roster, and they had every kid's name, and they wrote like ocean, space, whatever it was, and they had to take that and put it into a T-chart to compare both.
Yeah.
And then they had to like describe what they noticed about the data. But they weren't necessarily putting into like a big graph or chart necessarily.
They were just sharing what
But they were sharing their observations
That
of
was,
the
and they
data.
had like, it was like different types of food. Is that the assessment? It was like, or is that something?
Yeah, there's one about different types of food, and then the one that Laura's talking about, it's another 3rd one that they have. And last year's 1st grade decided not to do that one. For some reason, they just thought that the assessment, the first one with the foods, was just fine for it to get enough information about how well they understand graphs.
Because it was just like sorting the data.
Yeah,
right.
that's all it was. That's why we took it
It was
out.
making the T-chart, starting the data, being able to say how many left this, the totals, running the totals, and making the observations about them.
And did they have to like find the difference or something or no?
It was not in investigations, but it was in Common Core.
Okay.
Another I see like trajectory or that I noticed in K1 is like in K, again they have to be able to like make the values match on the T-chart, but it's just with two variables, and then or one variable, 2 sorts. In first, they have to be able, they use one, like how many pockets do you have, but they have to be able to say like X many students for this many pockets.
Yeah.
And then in second, they get more variables, like it could be like, what's your favorite food, pizza, ice cream, and blank. In third, they can ask an open-ended question like, what's your favorite place? And they have to be able to categorize and classify the data, which was such a challenge for them. It was like, okay,